So my friend Keith, along with Tom Lee, was a purveyor of the soft landing thesis, one that we would not go into recession in 2023. I have to give him credit. He is correct. Now the question is, are you holding on to that thesis for 2024? Why or why not?
It's hard to have a recession during inflationary times, but inflation is its own punishment. That's a separate thing. So even if we're not technically in a recession, the average person might still be losing ground.
Sorry about the delay here. I've had this deathly chest cold going on, but I'm getting better now, slow but steady. I wouldn't say I'm quite as far as Tom Lee, and I want to specify what I was talking about by a soft landing, but I'm glad to, and I'm going to drop a couple of chits about it now. So in particular, I really thought that in the early part of 2023, especially when people were, I thought, overreacting to what was going to happen to small regional banks, and it setting off like a major problem with the monetary system in the United States. I just thought that the doubts about the economy and the strength of its recovery were, at that point, really oversold, and there was a lot more pessimism than that was justified by the underlying economic data, and I'll quickly go through that. So lots of people, especially in the crypto sector, they look at the Fed or the government as the only people who create money. And the truth is that the vast majority of the money supply in circulation is created by commercial banks through lending. And that is called the M2 money supply. Now, the M2 money supply got absolutely slaughtered from the end of 2021 through most of 2022, but in the fourth quarter of 2022, it finally started to level off year over year, where a ton of money wasn't getting taken out of the economy merely by banks constricting their lending standards. So towards the end of 2022 and in early 2023, I thought that a lot of the pessimism was no longer justified because the money supply was no longer shrinking at the same rate that it had been. Unemployment was not showing signs of becoming a problem, and asset prices were completely melting down. And in particular, I was looking at the housing market from that point of view, that even though things were somewhat tepid, I didn't think that any of the conditions for an outright recession were in play as of early 2022. So I think part of the reason Brian started this room is that I'd been repeatedly kind of saying that I thought the Fed was on target for a quote unquote soft landing, and that things in the economy, based on the indicators that people look at to measure the economy, weren't as bad as the market or general commentary was as to the state and shape of the U.S. economy. And in particular, I was really keyed off in a bad way to David Sachs on the All In podcast, just like constantly disaster mongering about anything that doesn't agree with his politics, which is everything in politics, because Biden is president. Now, I've seen this on Twitter and heard it in here, and I understand the sentiment, but it caused me to look at data. But this idea that I'm not happy with a soft landing where prices are 50 to 100% higher, at least this caused me to look at the CPI data, and the CPI inflation from December 31st, 2019 through now is 19.6% overall. So things are 20% more expensive. Now, of course, we can talk about what it measures, how it measures, things like that. But generally speaking, it isn't 50 to 100%. The whole economy isn't ground beef. It isn't a price of milk. Even that stuff is moderated. So overall, although inflation has been problematic, it is not 50 to 100%. And Jerome Powell in particular seems to have done an exceptionally good job in managing a fiscal side of policy that had nothing to do with him, and COVID had nothing to do with him, and EIDL, PPP, ERC, all these crazy extended unemployment, all these things that got thrown at COVID, turns out that was not the correct response at all. For him to have moderated us back to this level at this point is genuinely impressive to someone who's followed financial markets for a long time.
I don't know. Everything being 20% more expensive means we've squandered 20% of the national wealth. That is a huge price to pay, but that's for the COVID lockdowns. And I think it's actually worse than 20% in scarce assets, which also matters because eventually people do want to own houses and things like that. And housing prices have still continued to be artificially inflated, which is really bad for people who are up and coming. So I think the bill has been very, very expensive. And sure, it may not be a recession in traditional terms, but everybody is 20% or more poorer. And that's a big deal.
A very wise man once tweeted that part of the beauty of the U.S. monetary system is that it outsources its inflation to the rest of the world, and that is by and large true. However, what I want to say here is that I think Brian started this room because I was taking another victory lap on my soft landing call from late 2022, early 2023, and all the way through. However, so I think the soft landing has been here. I think the soft landing has been here, and it is now that it's becoming apparent. Now, Brian had some really good points that, in particular, the fourth year of a first-year president tends to be like a great year for public markets. I think we will have at least a good first 6 months, but now, as much as I was drumming on for the soft landing before, I am not convinced that we don't have a problem on our hands for sometime in 2024, most likely in the back half, maybe the fourth quarter, maybe early 2025. But now we're going to get into a more serious problem than managing this monetary phenomena, which is managing the fiduciary phenomena, because, dear God, our deficit is in fact wildly out of control. And my hot take to Brian, which I'll just put here now, I think the surest fire legal way to influence an American election for the incumbent party is to buy the hell out of their long dated treasuries, because it will keep that end of the curve very, very low, and it will dampen any economic problems that may otherwise spring about from a normally functioning, like, open outcry auction market. And in particular, I think China has already started to do this, and they can do it via managing their current accounts deficit or outright buying in the auctions, which is more easy to trace. I think China has every incentive and every economic ability to hammer the back end, like the longest dated ends of the U.S. Treasury curve, in order to give Biden a sweetheart economy to get reelected on. So it is much harder to be good at monetary policy than fiscal policy. And the reason is because monetary policy tends to fix all of fiscal policy's mistakes. And it has had to do this repeatedly for the last 15 years, because after the first success of qualitative easing, no political party has ever wanted to balance a goddamn budget again. Neither of these parties want to do it for themselves. Neither the political nor the public class has the will to tighten their belts and fix this deficit issue. And now that we're out of this like one-time COVID adjustment period, like, there are going to be real problems, or I think there's going to be real problems. So I am happy to take a victory lap for my soft landing call in 2023. I think that 2024, I think that the next part, the fiscal policy part is much harder to solve. And from that point of view, I could envision serious problems. The only thing that may save us, and I really have to think about this, and I'm going to have to think about it and see how the next data comes in and whatnot, what might actually save us is the same thing that saved fucking Bill Clinton, and it is like a technological boom that is coming out of AI. Again, going way back, I think AI is going to be completely transformative, and if we can manage to stay out of our own way, this may actually get swept under the rug purely by productivity gains, because the productivity gains that come out of AI, if we don't totally like hamstring it or create massive problems before we can get there, could actually once again be like a massive transformation on the economy that will fix all of these problems. And I don't know if that's going to happen yet. So I don't have a soft landing call for 2024. I do want to think about it, because in a vacuum, if everything stayed the same, we would be fucked just based on fiscal problems, on budget problems. At a certain point, people do in fact look behind the curtain. AI might fix it. We'll see. We'll see.
You nailed the 2023 prediction, Keith, which is very difficult to do in this chaotic network world. But to extend the aeronautical analogy, I think we're in the midst of a touch and go. In 2023, who could have predicted this Cambrian explosion of large language models that pushed American technology companies to new heights? I think this was the proverbial life raft for the entire economy. And as you said, who knows where this goes to 2024, what sort of efficiencies are derived, what sort of job loss it creates. There's just so many unknowns here, but one thing is certain, this is the next boom. Second, who could have forecasted the residential real estate market would remain resilient despite all the rate hikes? It makes no sense. It befuddles even the most seasoned investors. I believe this is a supply issue, but I would never have believed that in Q4 2023, the residential real estate market would remain essentially flat. Third, I don't think anybody truly believed that Jerome Powell, Jay, had the gumption to raise rates as aggressively as he did, and specifically not the stewards of capital of Silicon Valley Bank or Silvergate, which led to their imminent demise. So again, rolling all of this up into a nice, neat package, some of the biggest things that happened in 2023 were completely unpredictable. I expect the same for 24.
Yeah, I think you nailed this wrap up. You're always making sort of a risk-adjusted forward best guess. Now, just because it happened to land my way doesn't mean that it landed my way in the exact way I thought it would. Pretty consistently, what you were referring to, i.e., the stability of banks in the face of the complete remarking of the existing treasury market, the resilience of real estate, residential real estate into the face of that, and the strength of the job market. All of those somewhat surprised me, and then were essentially the data points that caused me to feel like things were still on track to do better than most people were expecting. As for 2024, I'm still very much in we shall see mode. There's a couple of major things that should kind of give us, I feel like they're going to give us some insight in the next 6 weeks, say by early February. One will be we'll get some year-end data, in particular kind of Christmas retail spending and how the yield curve continues to shape up. Two would be Ukraine and Russia seem on track for some negotiated resolution. And three would be the same with Israel's war with Hamas. Seems to be on target for winding down, and at least so far hasn't set off the kind of larger ripples that it easily could. So I say I'd love to talk about more economic stuff in general, but I think we should revisit this topic in room maybe in early February and start to put together some public thoughts on where we think things are going to head in 2024. The only thing I do feel really confident in, regardless, not that it won't go down if everything goes down, and I think it'll just go down less, is that the entire compute hardware and software stack is just, I think it's going to do really, really well. Everything's going to have to be reworked. People's PCs, obviously now the refresh cycle on Macs and soon enough iPhones and iPads and Vision will be a repurchasing spree. Everything on edge compute, everything on servers, GPUs, TPUs, looks like CPUs as well. So I think everything in compute from way back when I thought compute was going to be the big winner in all of this, and it's only gotten better and better in what all of this is. So at this point, I think it's a complete rework of the entire tech stack and a lot of opportunity for software existing and nascent. And for that's sort of why I think of the Clinton era, because obviously the telecommunications boom was huge for the economy in that period, and this could be a similar phenomena.
But it's been a reallocation of wealth from productive to unproductive purposes. Inflation actually is a reallocation, and so in that sense, it's a misalignment. Also, I think it's a lot higher than 20% in certain categories. So, as you know, the official stats are always understated. And yeah, there's a big difference between 2% compounded and 4% compounded. It matters. Yes, we benefit from the exorbitant privilege of having 70% of our dollars held overseas. That's the benefit of being reserve currency. We can print and everybody else eats the inflation, but it also threatens the dollar's reserve currency status long term. And that catastrophic failure risk is also something that you have to price in. That is also squandering of the national wealth. No, first of all, wages don't go up as fast, so people end up being soft-fired. And second, when you get this nominal appreciation assets, the government takes half in taxes, so the government gets bigger, and people get stolen from through higher taxes on fake income. Here we agree. They'll kick the can down the road to the next president or to the beginning of the next term. They really don't want things to blow up during an election year, but sometimes it's not in their control. Trump, unfortunately for him, had COVID hit during an election year. I guess I just don't think that 20 to 40% inflation in real assets is a soft landing. So just because it doesn't hit the exact nominal definition of recession doesn't mean it's a soft landing. Most people are in pain, and that's why Biden's approval ratings are in the toilet. Well, that's easy. That's purely because of inflation, because real estate is an inflation hedge. If we managed to avoid every recession, but in exchange had 20, 30, 40% inflation, that would be a complete disaster and be the definition of the hardest of hard landings every single time. I'd rather have a nominal recession for 1 or 2 quarters than have 20 to 40% inflation each time. For the record, I don't think we're done with inflation yet. I think they're going to stop tightening for the election year to get Biden reelected. But what's going to happen is inflation is going to rebound quite nastily in 2025 and up, and then it'll be much harder to control because their credibility will be shot. If, on the other hand, Powell does keep tightening and really tries to nip inflation in the bud, then it will cost Biden the reelection. So the current administration is between a rock and a hard place.
I agree it's a reallocation. And I suppose for framing here, what I'm leaving out here is that we can't go back in time, make COVID not happen, make 2020's bad decisions not happen. So in the context of that, I think the job has been really well done. And I'm going to put up some information next. Again, I agree with you, but I would put on the other side, I mean, pardon the pun, this is the original Keynesian beauty contest, right? So all of the other central banks essentially followed ours. Now, that's because we're the reserve. Who knows if it's like the horse or the tail, but it sort of doesn't matter. No other currency has relatively, let's leave Bitcoin aside, no other currency has relatively outperformed the dollar in such a way as to meaningfully threaten our reserve currency status. Not that it couldn't happen, not that we were not so much closer this time, not that we could get away with it. Again, this level of easing and not central bank foolishness, because it wasn't the central bank that did it, but economic foolishness on behalf of the politicians in 2020 who were responsible for the vast majority of the money that went out. Historically, you would have been correct, but that hasn't been the case through this period. This is the exact same period that I quoted inflation numbers on from the end of 2019 until right now. The nominal wage growth is about 5.1%, 5.2% in that period per year. And what you're seeing here, the line is the mean, the average. And then you've got the annual rolling time series as well. So in this period, nominal wage growth has outstripped inflation, i.e. real wage growth has been about 1.2% above inflation in the period end of 2019 to right now. Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong, but we're mixing things a little bit here. You know, this old school Friedman opinion that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomena. That is normally ascribed to central banks. But again, I think what I keep trying to point out to people is that the amount of money that went out in this case was not central banking policy at all. It was money that was generated in the political chambers of Republican Washington or Republican president and a Democratic Congress, in which both parties have a ton of responsibility mutually between what happened here. And in my opinion, the Fed in this case is just cleaning up the mess. As far as everyone's in pain and not liking Biden, you and I both know that is a sentiment check, right? Like, narrative follows price. The last 18 months, 20 months have been absolutely brutal for, in lots of different ways. And it has been general pessimism about inflation and the economy and recessions and whatnot. But that is immediately changing now that like this year's GDP is on track for like 2.6% real growth. Now we'll see what happens. And granted, these are, subject to manipulation and whatnot, but whatever manipulation they're subject to now, they were likely subject to before. And so at some point we've got to choose which apples we'll call apples or which oranges we'll call oranges and then sort of just discuss there, I think. Well, it's not an inflation hedge when a recession hits. It wasn't an inflation hedge in 2009, which is the last time we had any meaningful inflation really, or 2009, 2010. But this is definitely a one size fits one, never been seen before combination of economic events. So we're all sort of mixing terms here, but at least if the definition of recession is of a soft landing is avoiding recession while not allowing unemployment to get too high, nor allowing inflation to get out of control, I do think they've hit it. And real estate is an inflation hedge, but it's not an inflation hedge in the case of recession. The period, I think it's the 10-year period following like a recession, which we were in some kind of tepid version of. It historically hasn't worked that way, although on average that's always been true over a longer time period. Totally agree. But again, I think the counterfactual here is inflation. Well, the last time inflation started off like this was the 1970s, and that was brutal. The last time we had deflation, i.e. prices returning to the level they were before, was 1929 to 1933, which was an awful period. This one I would take a bet with you on, because so Powell didn't bend to Trump. I don't think he's going to bend to Biden. I know that's a Saxism right now. I know you're no David Sachs. Thank God for that. I really don't think the Fed works like that. I think if anything, China would be the one that would contribute to that. And, the reason I would bet with you is twofold. One, because I think there is some actual likelihood of a deficit-induced, recession in, at least 2025, if not a little bit sooner. And two, I don't think I think Powell is moving rates with his mouth the same way he did before. And so he can talk like this and then not do anything. And again, the sentiment is just going to address itself. So I don't think Powell will cut as much as the market thinks he's going to cut. But I think he can just, sing those like sort of dulcet dovish tones. And that in and of itself is enough to sort of solve the problems. But the joke I was going to make earlier,
I agree with that. I think Powell is his own man. Still, there may be pressure from the rest of the Federal Reserve. Powell doesn't act alone, but I agree. Powell is his own person. But it's a sad state of affairs when we have to rely upon the price of money, the single most important price signal in the economy, to be set by a small group of people. Not always true. You could be in a recessionary environment, but if you had 20-30% inflation or some crazy amount of inflation, then real estate would still levitate. So it's not quite necessarily true. It just depends on the degree of inflation.
So this was the joke I was going to tell earlier, but comparing Clinton's mid-90s and the telecoms boom with the disaster right now and the AI boom and the ensuing compute boom. If we do get out of it, it will be because Powell and perhaps some other economic factors like Ukraine wrapping up, like the Middle East not becoming a problem, like some version of global detente in terms of trade wars. The only way this works and we don't see serious economic pain is if somehow the equity markets in the economy can survive, just longer. If they can get to heaven right before the bond market knows they're dead, then it will be okay. But that's sort of a long shot, in my opinion, at this point. It is a sad state of affairs, and I'm the apologist, right? And so I'm just sort of singing the song of why it could be okay, and that there are some good actors even in a problematic system. Like I think at this point, this system up until recently has been sort of the worst system there is, except for all the rest of them. My take for a long time, and I truly believe this is like the core value of Bitcoin. I think so. When the bond vigilantes taught the U.S. government a lesson in the late 70s and early 80s, the U.S. government got the message, and they started to buy and manipulate into the long-dated treasury curve to stop that from happening again. Bitcoin cannot be captured in that same way. So I think Bitcoin, both for the United States and for governments around the world, will become a way for citizens and economic actors to hold their governments accountable for the fiscal and monetary performance that they're putting in simply by moving the valuation of their currency versus Bitcoin. And I actually think that's Bitcoin's I think that's why Bitcoin works so beautifully in this system and is net an incredible positive, provided it doesn't actually kill the system. Because I think if it actually killed the system, that'd be like disaster and like really bad for humanity and individual people. But they can work together perfectly, or at least it can be, the worst system except for all the others for another 100 years. And that's my core thing that I love about Bitcoin. That, and of course, number go up. Which, for the record, out loud, I know you're not in these chats and DMs and whatnot, but in the traditional finance chats, I'm the one saying they're idiots for not realizing how powerful crypto is. both in terms of an investment class and in terms of a monetary phenomena. So I'm an equal opportunity a-hole. You know that I'm the angel and devil advocate. At this point, you probably know that.